This podcast contains material of a violent and disturbing nature. It is not suited for all audiences.
Welcome to episode 3 of Horror Tales, a podcast in which you can sit back and listen to a scary story. If you haven't done so yet, please subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast directory. To support the show further, simply take a moment to rate, review, and share it on your favorite social media. Today's story was written by Ted E. Grau and published in his collection, The Nameless Dark. The story was abridged for this production and is called Transmission. Even this far out, away from the light and the bilge and the droning nouveau bullshit lounge music, rasping from a purposely old LP, things were still sort of a blur. The same blurry party with the same blurry people, with annoying hipster headgear and piercings and tattoos and post-ironic t-shirts and uniformly blurry beards. The off-brand bottle of blurry liquor in his hand. The blurry, slurry skank that he had seen before but never recognized. Pressing in too close, breathing all of his air. The shouting. The broken furniture. The fight. The blood. The weak sauce ghetto insults heard from a safe distance as he ran out of the blurry room and the blurry house on a blurry street in a forgotten Midwestern city that blurred brown and green but mostly brown under 1,000 jumbo jets every single day. A blur, all of it. And none of it worth a single fuck. Max scratched at the crusted gash on the side of his face and concentrated on the tunnel of pavement opening foot by foot ahead of him. Trying to clear the blur from his mind as he drove west, ever west, in a last-ditch effort to outrace the smudge of his past. This was it, he felt. A wagon train of one fueled by a last hope for blessed clarity waiting amongst the swaying palms of the Pacific coast. Failing that, he'd drive off the end of the goddamn continent and drown in the murk of the darkened deep. Max blinked his eyes and lit up a cigarette, checking the cheap plastic compass he picked up at the truck stop in Grand Island, Nebraska, stuck lopsided to the dash of his shitty late model Dodge. West. The bobbing arrow assured him. West. He was still heading in the right direction. At last, that much was certain. So here he was, knifing down Highway 50 west of McGill, Nevada, as the last 2 days and nights. Somehow, without knowing exactly where or exactly why, Max had drifted off of I-80, that grey tentacle of government-issue cement that stretched the length of this vast savage land. But it didn't matter. His cheap plastic compass assured him that he was heading west. And that was good enough for Max. That certainty was good enough for now. Small victories in the war against the unknown. Exhaling a small nimbus cloud of smoke into the windshield, Max sat back, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he relaxed and opened the window, allowing the cool, dry air to clean out the car. The blur had begun to recede, which allowed him a smile. Max turned on the radio, switching immediately from the dead FM presence of his last layover to the strange anonymity of AM. Max pressed scan and skimmed over an offering of Mexicali accordion music and a low-rent advert for industrial shedding. Arriving at what he loved most, the born-againer martyrdom rant against the encroaching forces of the Antichrist.
And so the days of tribulation are nigh, my brothers and sisters,
roared the firebrand, buzzing Max's tiny speakers.
And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass. But the end is not yet here. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilence and earthquakes in diverse places. All these are the beginning of sorrows.
The signal faded a bit, but came back strong a few seconds later, allowing Max to continue his front row seat to the theater of holy fear.
The signs are everywhere, if one knows how to look with the eyes of Jesus and the mind of God. The return of the chosen ones to their ancient land, the gathering of crows, the massing of armies.
Hoots and hollers from the unseen audience gave credibility to these ravings that would be deemed insanity in the Western world if spewed under a different banner, or no banner at all.
It's all in the Word, and the Word shall come to pass.
The Word, Max chuckled and pressed scan again, starting the lottery anew. As the radio scan continued to cycle through dead air, Max looked out into the night around him. The range of his headlights hinted at an endless stretch of dried-out nothingness, colonized by scrub grass, creosote bush, cacti, and probably a fair share of bleached bones of varying size and species. This backcountry was broken by the occasional squatty house, built low and set far back from the highway, as if the structure itself was trying to run from civilization and, reaching the end of its tether, collapsed glumly onto the dusty ground in defeat. Max could never figure out why anyone, or anything, with any sort of viable option would choose to live in such a godforsaken environment. The radio found a tether and stopped on a fuzzy station, espousing the tourist attractions of the area.
Northern Nevada. Some of the most accessible examples of these mysterious petroglyphs can be found at Grimes Point, about 12 miles east of Fallon on Highway.
And just like that, the signal was gone again. Scan. Max was pondering the important issue of how petroglyphs differed from hieroglyphs when the radio halted its roll at the very far end of the electronic dial. After a brief silence, the weak signal transmitted indistinct sounds, like whispers, intermingled with an odd chanting that faded in and out like a spectral dirge. Intrigued by this strange combination and hoping for a broadcast of a lonely Indian powwow, Max turned up the volume. But the higher it went, the softer the voice and chant became, going silent. There was no apparent signal, but the radio scan was still stopped, locked in on something. Perplexed, Max noticed that the compass on his dash began to shimmy in its housing, spinning this way and that, even though the road ahead was straight as an arrow. The silence was shot through by a booming intonation that blasted from the speakers, startling Max, who grasped at the volume button, barely noticing the brownish, misshapen hulk that lurched onto the highway ahead at the far end of his headlights, gripping something large in its massive paws. Max smashed the brakes while cranking the wheel away from the creature, which dragged the half-eaten carcass of a deer, or was it a dog, up the rocky embankment as the Dodge swerved by, skidding onto the shoulder and burying the front grille into the opposite hillside as the radio went silent again. The car engine gurgled and pitched under the slightly crumpled hood, then jerked to a stop with a wheeze. Breathing hard, Max fixed his eyes on the compass. It was spinning like a top inside the plastic housing. Was this from the crash? But the car wasn't moving and probably wouldn't be anytime soon. The radio was again cycling through dead air. And what was that huge fucking thing that ran across the road? Pebbles rolled down the hillside and onto the car, like 100 tapping fingers. Max sat frozen, blinking his eyes that were obviously playing tricks on him after too many hours of the road. That thing. Was it a desert inbred? Some sort of mutated bear that wandered too close to a nuclear test site? This was Nevada after all, the bullpen of the atom bomb. Max was unnerved, more by what he did know of what he saw than what he didn't. Or maybe it was what he heard. They both happened so fast, so close together. He was sweating and felt as if the car was closing around him, like a tin can prison. He locked the doors, not sure if what was out there was worse than what he heard inside, as he quickly realized what most terrified him was that the radio would again find that baritone chanting that seemed to echo from somewhere impossible deep. He reached out hesitantly to push the off button, when the scan again stopped on the far end of the dial. But this time he heard weeping. The strange, uncomfortable sound of a man crying, as if profoundly grieved by the tragically occurred, or the unfortunately inevitable. This stayed Max's hand before the sobbing splintered into sudden, spastic laughter. What was this nonsense? What sort of psychotic local pirate station owner or ham radio operator was pranking over the air, scaring the shit out of those who scanned the far end of the dial? This fucker owed Max a new shitty late model Dodge. Or at least a ride to the coast. The laughter then stopped, and in the silence, the mic picked up sounds of papers being shuffled, tapes stacked methodically. Then, a flat voice that sounded distant in tone and emotion began.
You can hear everything in the desert.
The voice wavered, as if the speaker needed to stop, to breathe, to collect himself.
The buzzing of insects, the hooting of owls, the mad yap of the coyotes.
You got that right, Max chimed in with irritation, to no one but the unhearing voice at the other end of the radio transmission, which came to life again.
Sometimes those sounds fall away by some unspoken agreement. And in that profound silence, the right type of ears can hear, can sense the softer, more terrible noises that lurk underneath the normal nighttime din.
Another pause, another intake of breath.
The desert whispers to me, telling me things I never knew existed, never dared dream, giving up secrets older than the primordial soup. I record these secrets as I have been tasked and broadcast them when I can. But the recording is the key, and I have been diligent, as were those who came before me.
Outside the car, dry lightning carved the sky, highlighting clouds that looked like seething shapes forming on the horizon.
If you could rewrite the Bible, the Nag Hammadi, the tablets of Thoth, directly from the source, would you sacrifice your life to do it?
Another religious Looney Tune. This one with a shiny heretical paint job, Max thought, trying to chuckle in spite of the gnawing fear that was coiling in his stomach. He quickly turned the key and tried to give life to a halting ignition, while avoiding glancing out into the darkness. He was still shaken by the crash and nervous that he might be stranded out on this forgotten ribbon of highway, with this obviously insane misanthrope and whatever loped up into the hills. After much protesting and cajoling from Max, the battered engine sputtered to life. He revved out the kinks, then backed out from the embankment and onto the highway, jammed the car into drive, and drove wobbly on in the same direction he was going. The voice continuing its diatribe, with Max trying not to listen. As he built up speed, the radio signal got stronger, and Max found himself listening more intently in spite of himself, finding courage in motion, and increasingly fascinated by this obviously deranged individual who somehow attained access to the radio airwaves.
It's late in my mission,
The voice said,
and nearly time for me to move on. I'm waiting for my replacement so the work and the message can continue.
The signal started to fade, and so Max slowed. He was now fully engrossed in this mournful monologue, and felt somehow compelled to keep listening, as if guided by a gentle outside force. Nearly losing the signal altogether, Max stopped the car in the middle of the empty highway, dropped into reverse, and trundled backwards into the darkness, cut open by his white reverse lamps, until the signal increased in strength again. He stopped and idled, leaning forward, as if to better connect with this lone speaker in the darkness.
The desert tells me to do this, and I do as I'm told, because you never, ever argue with the desert.
The voice giggled again, this time with more mirth, but it ended with a terrified edge as before.
So, now I whisper to you, speaking for the desert, speaking for those behind the desert, and speaking for myself, as my time here has lately become short.
The car engine shuddered, ceased, and expired. Max didn't notice.
There is beauty and horror here, wisdom and madness, and I have drunk deeply of it all. Will you do the same?
The man went silent. Lightning licked the sky. Max, again feeling the car close in around him, began to wonder if this was merely a one-way conversation.
Will you?
The voice asked again. Me? Max answered.
You.
The voice continued as if in confirmation.
Will you do the same?
The signal wavered and buzzed, then faded into fuzz again. Max flung open his door and tumbled out of the car. Rushing to the smashed hood, he pushed against the cracked grille with all his might and moved the Dodge backward, gaining momentum as he labored. As it picked up speed, Max ran to the open car door and jumped inside, breathing hard as he turned up the volume. The signal came back in and Max quickly veered the car off the road onto the graveled shoulder, settled in behind the wheel and listened.
The work must go on, as the truth must be told.
The voice trailered off with a zigzagging reverberation, as if impacted by an outside interference, before returning again.
For I speak of gods and monsters, creation and eternal life, and the destruction of both, the birth of stars and those things living inside them. Truth of truths. By those cosmic entities, that whisper secrets, transcendence, liberation, that whisper secrets, terrible paradise. The awakening is at hand. Transcendence. Liberation.
And with that, the battery, the last life force of Max's shitty late model Dodge, blinked and died. Max sat behind the wheel, in total and utter silence, scarcely able to breathe, scarcely able to believe what he had just heard, as his eyes rimmed with tears. It was as if a water balloon popped inside his brain, drenching his insides and leaving behind nothing but a newly scrubbed view of his destiny, his meaning. He felt reborn, dancing atop a hunger he never knew existed. No longer was he worried about reaching the coast. All he knew now was that he had to keep listening to this transmission, at whatever cost. The increased strength of the signal just before the death of his ride meant that the tower, and most likely the source of the voice, was near. Max scrambled out of his car, intent on finding the strange person and learning more. This broken, impossibly enlightened man knew something, believed in something with every fiber of his tortured being, and Max had to figure out why. Max was out of the car and running up the center of the highway, and soon discovered a weed-choked access road that led off from the main drag and up into the noxious wilds of the Nevada desert. Max's gaze followed what he surmised was the direction of the path up into the hill country, where he noticed a small red light floating in the higher elevations, like a disembodied eye keeping watch over the dead sand below. Max looked back at his car, threw his keys into the darkness, and set out for the guiding red light that lurked somewhere out there, waiting for him. Bony fingers of lightning crackled above, strobe lightning the ominously shaped clouds. Max walked quickly, his path between lightning flashes barely illuminated by a waxing moon, hanging low and sallow over the ring of mountains, gnawing the sky like the craggy molars of a monstrous exposed jawbone. His shoes crunched over shattered plates of volcanic stone, pushing out the noises of the desert that the quivering, hollow voice described. The hovering red light was getting closer, and so Max moved onward, continuing his tumbleweed journey by rootless foot, Once again he found courage in forward motion, scant as it was. The meaning. The meaning. After nearly an hour, Max spied a stand of stunted trees that seemed to coalesce out of the darkness on a ridge slightly above. As he neared, he could just make out a dilapidated shack squatting amid the gnarled timber, blasted ghostly white by decades, maybe centuries of enduring the spite of the brutal Nevada sun, which seemed extra angry with this part of the world, as if by result of an old and festering grudge. Every 100 yards or so, a rough-hewn stone monolith of greenish-gray stone, which didn't seem to originate from the surrounding hills, or anywhere on the continent really, stood sentry, forming a wide, easy-to-miss circle around the circumference of the ridge. Passing through the loose-knit ring of stone, Max quickened his pace and approached the old shanty, which was built up atop an ancient foundation of crumbling adobe, like those found in the ruins of the cliff-faced domiciles constructed by the mysteriously vanished Anasazi that Max had explored several years back while tumbling through New Mexico. Anchored by the clay foundation, random building materials were haphazardly pasted and lashed to keep out the wind and the sun, and sporadic bouts of furious downpours that sought to wash away those godless things that made their home in the desert. Max walked to the front door, leaned in close and listened. The faint, hollow voice that was now so familiar could be heard inside. Emboldened, Max tried the door and found it unlocked. He opened it and pushed inward. The door creaked on protesting hinges and set open. Yellowish light spilling out into the night, momentarily blinding Max. The voice was louder. Nothing moved inside. Steeling his resolve, Max entered. The small outer room was lit by several naked light bulbs that hung from the ceiling, buzzing with flies and beetles. The raw light cast harsh shadows on stacks of moldering newsprint, boxes of moth-eaten clothes, and various detritus that one would normally associate with a bunker existence. Canned food, jugs of yellow liquid, a gas mask hanging from the barrel of a large-bore sniping rifle. The voice was coming from a back room, sectioned off by a ratty curtain. Max walked through the maze of refuse and pushed back the drape, terrified and thrilled in equal measure to meet the intermediary of this message that had brought him from the known road into the weird wilderness. Max found no one waiting beyond the curtain. Instead, he discovered a cramped, yet deserted room, hemmed in by high racks of notebooks and journals, facing a corner heaped with a precariously arranged amalgam of new and incredibly old radio equipment surrounding a makeshift broadcast booth, analog modulators, reel-to-reel players, a turntable, magnetic cassette docks, CD ports, and a laptop, all wired together in the same haphazard fashion as the shack himself. A DIY broadcast station, carved out of overstuffed shelving and countless stacks of yellowing paper. The old iron office chair behind the microphone was empty. A digital recording was playing, continuing a pre-taped monologue transmitted out into the desert night, into Max's car, into countless other cars and homes and minds.
And so,
The recorded voice continued.
the work must go on, even here at this broadcast station at Grimes Point.
As the voice continued, Max explored the room, picking through the reams of notebooks and folders, blowing off thick red dust that had settled everywhere. and reading a few lines of wildly advanced esoteric learning, mind-bending formulae, non-Euclidean calculus, quantum physics, interlaced with blurbs of history and a shocking understanding of the universe and interdimensional travel. Max moved to the broadcast table where lay an open journal. Paging through it, he discovered bizarrely grouped information assembled into monologues, written out in a sort of movie script format, similar to the ones he heard on the radio, similar to the one the voice was relaying at this very moment, which Max followed along with his finger.
Upon receiving my assignment and arriving here, I spent some time alone among the rocks, discovering the promised doorway that I shall soon revisit for the final time.
Max rifled through the notebooks and tapes around him, noticing dates that went back several hundred years. This was not just a broadcast booth, Max realized, but a library, a repository of arcane and antiquated knowledge off the scale of human imagination. Stunned by the implications of what loomed around him, Max then noticed a line of several dozen framed photographs on the wall, of different people manning the microphone, sitting in that heavy chair, moving back through the ages, from color pictures to black and white, to muddy sepia tone. 24 men and women of varying ages, races, and obvious social standing, all sitting in the same pose in front of the same microphone, with the same grim expression and slightly unbalanced gleam in their eyes. The most recent speaker continued his taped oration as Max moved in closer and squinted at the last photo on the right, which showed a man not much older than him, staring hauntingly into the camera of an unknown photographer, the instruments of transmission glowing behind him.
I felt as though I had passed into a pinhole, poked through reality, taking me outside linear time and into the seething void. This is just one outpost, numbered 6, and is one of many, where others like me continue the work to reveal.
The fly-spattered light bulbs flickered, and Max looked up, noticing perplexing lines and curves etched into the ceiling, surrounding what appeared to be several intricate, overlapping star maps. But the maps didn't feature any of the known constellations, or none of which Max was familiar.
I speak of what whispers to me, through the sounds of the desert, of elder mathematics, the language of all creation, the root and the key of what we know as eldritch magic. That which sank Relay, raised Atlantis, and built the sacred pyramids and other abandoned monuments to the outer gods across our crowded sphere.
Max sank slowly into the stout broadcast chair and gazed wide-eyed around the room, as if a sudden realization clicked in his head, giving confirmation to something he had always surmised, but didn't dare believe, and rarely ventured to dream. West, ever west, out into the Pacific, fate or drown, fate or drown. Max's eyes bulged as he listened with every atom of his being, taking in the words as the voice went on to tell of the outer gods, who will come and take away those who know how to ask. The workers at Outpost 6 at Grimes Point are the newest members of these few, collecting information imparted in purposely small, dissociated segments to keep the recorder sane for as long as humanly possible. Sitting in the chair with his eyes staring straight ahead, while his mind began to venture several dimensions away, Max didn't see the bathroom just off the broadcast room, where a bloody razor and clumps of hastily shaved body hair clogged the sink. Max didn't see the trail of blood that led out of the smashed back door, over the dusty yard, past the unnatural mounds and monoliths surrounding the property, and into the sand of the endless desert. Max didn't see the speaker of the voice just hours before he arrived, standing on the brink of Grimm's Point and flinging himself down onto the curiously arranged rocks below. Max also didn't see the body of the man disappear into the void before it hit the craggy bottom, warping away to a swirling, unnameable infinitum of places unknowable, where he would join the roiling mass of omnipotent chaos that probed for a way back into our tiny plane of existence, settling in the meantime for psychic missives sent from the beyond. Max didn't see these things because he was sitting at the microphone, his new post at Outpost 6, taking in the words in preparation for continuing the work.
So,
The speaker in the picture, the speaker who dove into Grimes Point and into boundless structured abyss just hours earlier, concluded in his strange, hollow voice.
I leave this sacred burden to you who have found your way to this humble temple of the outer gods. Fare thee well. Signing off, and bid this forgotten place goodbye, knowing that you are already on the doorstep, and the cycle continues.
The voice gave out and the transmission ended. In the dead silence of the tiny shack, the noises of the desert began to creep in, as well as those softer, more terrible sounds that lurk underneath the normal nighttime din. Max was listening. Thank you for listening to Horror Tales. If you enjoy the show, please take a moment to share it on your favorite social media. My name is Max Ablitzer and I'm the producer of Horror Tales, including its original soundtrack and sound design. If you're in need for original music for your own project, please get in touch via the website www.horrortalespodcast.com. A special thank you to Ted E. Grau for contributing the story Transmission, which was presented here in a shortened version. The full version is part of his collection The Nameless Dark, and Ted also just released his first novel, which is called I Am the River. You can visit Ted E. Grau on his website at www.tegrau.com. That is www.tegrau.com. Also, a huge thank you to the voice actors featured in this episode, who are, in order of appearance, Dave Nyland as the crazy preacher, Jessica Miller in the tourist radio announcement, and Aaron Godon in the role of the voice of the desert. I hope you enjoyed listening, and let's meet again on the next episode of Horror Tales.